Welcome to the Cafe Culture Podcasts, a season of discussions on politics, philosophy, culture and science.
Thanks, Anna, and thank you very much for the invitation to come along tonight. It's really great to be here, and I always love coming back to Newcastle, and it's such a small, friendly city and such beautiful architecture. I was walking up from the station thinking about just how well it works as a city, particularly when we were discussing this just before, if you compare it to somewhere like Manchester. So delighted to be here. And just to explain a little bit about the organisation that I work for, IPPR North. So IPPR is a national think tank, but it's one of the very few that has a dedicated organisation for the north of England that actually talks about policy beyond Westminster. So IPPR North, we were founded in 2006, and our purpose is about trying to champion the voice of people and businesses and third sector organisations in the north of England, trying to make sure that those voices are heard at Westminster. And of course, with Devolution, we're increasingly talking to some of the new mayors and some of the new combined authorities and trying to make sense of that agenda as well. So what we do is we try to come up with new ideas, we try to convene new conversations in order to try and think about what are the new policy that we need to try and deal with some of the economic and social challenges that we face. So this evening, I want to address the question that we've got about Northern Devolution, whether it's a powerhouse or an underdog. And I want to do that really by starting with a reminder of what Northern Powerhouse was all about, where it came from, if you like. So Northern Powerhouse, a term coined by George Osborne back in 2014, and it was very fitting because he was giving a speech in the Manchester Museum of Science and Industry. So it seemed very appropriate for him to talk about powerhouses in a place where lots of steam engines and old planes and this kind of thing. So it really worked for that environment. But it actually caught on. It caught on beyond the area of Manchester. And it really became a phrase which was used to help galvanise people and businesses and wider investment, a sort of collective vision that people could get behind, and that vision of a sort of better north. So that's kind of where it originated from. But of course, that vision was quite particular in George Osborne's mind. His vision was very much of a building a city between Manchester and Leeds, about trying to strengthen the connections between those two cities and to harness what he called the benefits of agglomeration, the benefits of densification of people and place in order to sort of drive the economy. And that's very much what his vision was of a northern future. And you often hear that referred to about building a new London in the north. But 4 years on, what has changed, and is that vision of Northern Powerhouse still relevant, and where does devolution fit in with that whole project? Well, first of all, I think it's worth considering what's actually changed since George gave us his vision of how the north could develop. Well, we've had a long period of stagnating economy since the recession and crash of 2008. And even now, 4 years since he coined that term, we've still got really big issues with stagnating levels of economic growth and productivity, stagnating wages. So some of our research shows that wages now are actually lower than they were in 2007. And we've got a real sense of the economy really just ticking over, not really moving in a positive direction. So that's a real challenge for those of us who work in this field. And it's a challenge for the powerhouse too, as to whether it can realise some of that growth longer term. The second thing is we have had a bit of devolution. Devolution has started to come through, and I guess you could credit George Osborne with some of that. But the problem is that it's a bit partial, it's a bit piecemeal. So Manchester have got a mayor, so have Liverpool City Region, so have Tees Valley, Sheffield's got Dan Jarvis now, a big discussion there about Yorkshire, and you've also got the discussions going on about north of the Tyne deal, which is certainly much further ahead than many other places. So devolution is starting to trickle down, you might say, but very partial and very piecemeal. And we at IPPR North have always been fans of devolution, but we've always said, look, if you're going to have devolution, then you need a clear framework for that devolution. You need to be clear what the rules of the game are, what the terms of engagement are. And that's what's really been missing. And there's a real challenge at the minute because it feels as if the current government have kind of lost the bottle a little bit for devolution, and there's a need to kind of reboot that going forward. And then thirdly, we've also had a growing sense of northern identity, I think, over the last few years since Powerhouse was coined. And we've seen that recently with the Convention of the North meeting in Newcastle, just back at the beginning of September. So a group of all northern leaders across party lines, faith leaders, leaders of trade unions, leaders of third sector organisations coming together in Newcastle to sort of argue, well, could we work together to come up with a united voice to Westminster? So that's some of the things that have changed. And the question, I guess, I want to ask tonight is what needs to change in the future if devolution is going to be a powerhouse rather than an underdog? And I think there's three things that we need. First of all, the whole discussion on devolution and powerhouse and all of that needs to be much more inclusive in the future. It needs to be much more inclusive of the voices of different people across the north of England. For example, we need much more women in the discussion, much greater diversity, and we need that diversity to help get new ideas and perspectives into the policy debate. Secondly, when it comes to people, and I talk about this a lot, one of the problems with the way in which UK policy works is that we tend to rely very much on assumptions about what people want or what they think. So we typically, in the Northern Powerhouse debate so far, we've focused a lot on big infrastructure, on the kind of nuts and bolts, if you like, of how an economy works. And that's fine, and that's really important. But you need to do more than that. You need to also think about people directly, because often policy thinks about people in the abstract. We use words like productivity or growth, which don't really mean much in everyday terms to most of us in terms of what we do in our work or what we do at home. So we need less abstraction and more reality, and more listening to sort of the human experience of living in the north, and more about the lived experience of people in employment, in school, in college. All of that needs to come much further up the policy agenda so that can actually help to create and shape policy for the future. So that's the first thing, much more about people in a future powerhouse, and more types of people, and greater listening to their experience of what their life is like in the north. Second of all, we need something about place, because again, the powerhouse debate to date has been very much focused on cities. Northern Powerhouse, in terms of what George Osborne thought, was the cities of Leeds and Manchester coming closer together. And that's one idea of how cities could work. And agglomeration, the idea that if you concentrate people and places and capital in our biggest places, and that will help to drive the economy. That's really been the central vision behind Powerhouse so far. But we need to do better than that, because there's a growing, emerging, sense that we need to think about places in a much more diverse way, because the north of England is not just 5 or 6 big cities. It's a huge ecosystem of smaller towns and cities, villages, collections of small houses. That's what the north of England is. It's a much more polycentric region than policy sometimes has us believe. And towns, market towns, villages all play a role in making our economy work. And we have to stop reducing places to their economic function, because you often hear this in policy that this place is productive and this place isn't, but that's not helpful. We need to think about places in their true sort of sense of purpose. Places play an economic role, but they also play a social role, and they also play a role in terms of identity. People feel connected to place, and all of those different senses of and understandings of place need to be given much more priority in the policy making. And then thirdly, there is a question about power. I mentioned devolution right at the start and how it's a little bit partial, a little bit piecemeal. And it remains a fact that the UK is one of the most centralised countries in the world. We collect the lowest local tax of any G7 country. And if you compare the decision-making process in the UK with other European countries, there are far fewer decisions made locally in the UK than anywhere else in Europe. So we need to change that. because our argument would be that if you involve people locally in those decision makings, you probably will get a better outcome, because people and decision makers locally will arguably have a better understanding of the challenges and a better sense of what the opportunities are longer term as well. So by devolving power, by giving people a greater sense of control over the decisions that affect their lives, then arguably you're actually going to get better outcomes for a place as well. So devolution isn't perfect, and it is partial, but it is worth giving. It is worth us giving it a go. But what needs to happen is the government need to provide a much more stronger commitment to it and a much greater coherence as to how they see it moving forward. The mayors have started that process, and we're starting to see devolution roll out in other areas too, like north of the Tyne, and hopefully eventually in Yorkshire too, when they work out what they want to do. The big thing about it for me is that it needs to be a bottom-up process. It can't be something that's just simply imposed on areas of the north. And for that to happen, it needs to have a much stronger democratic element to it. We've got the directly elected mayors in some areas, but what would be really good is not only to have devolved power, but devolved accountability. Because you can't rely solely on one person to try to be representative of everybody. There needs to be a mechanism whereby people living in an area can also get involved in the conversation. And that's about deliberative democracy as well as representative democracy. And I think that's what devolution needs. It needs that push from the centre in terms of government giving it the commitment, the powers and the resources that it needs to work, but it also needs to involve people in those conversations too, if it's to really be sustainable longer term. So that's my prescription, I guess, for 3 different things that we could use to try and strengthen devolution longer term and try to make the North more of a powerhouse, if you like, rather than an underdog. And I just want to finish by arguing that there's something about the language in all of this, that this term about powerhouses, or in the West Midlands you've got the Midlands engine. There is something kind of odd about the language that we use about places like the North or the Midlands, and I think it's worth us just reflecting on whether whether we want to be a powerhouse, whether that's something that we would aspire to as a region or as a place, and whether we also need to think about what we mean by economic growth in all of that discussion too, and whether that growth should be actually a means to an end rather than the end that we seek. So what can Powerhouse do for us rather than what we can do for the Powerhouse? So thanks very much, and I look forward to some questions after.
Hi everyone. As I was having a think about what I was going to say today, obviously I looked at the leaflet and we looked at the title of the talk, Powerhouse or Underdog, is Northern Devolution running out of steam? I suppose to continue on the transport analogy, my first thought was not necessarily, but it's probably in first gear. There were a few things that we were asked to touch upon as we speak to you today, connectivity between the regions, and hopefully I can give a little bit of a perspective on that from a transport planner's point of view. How do we build infrastructure to support devolution, and also how do we do things like develop and retain skills? I thought I would maybe start by just saying a little bit about my own sort of thoughts about building an infrastructure to support devolution. I think it's fair to say that certainly over the past few years, the North has not necessarily had as much devolution as other areas in the country. To an extent, you could say that was sandwiched between some devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales, etc., that have quite a lot of power to be able to influence what's happening in their areas. And we're often compared to London, and the fact that obviously there is a mayor of London who has also quite a lot of power there. And there's been a bit of a vacuum, I would say, in the North about having institutions that enable us to be able to bring forward agendas and to get people involved in the same way as those areas in particular. Some of you may remember, for example, that until relatively recently there were things such as regional development agencies, mixed views about whether they were successful or not, but they did at least allow areas to have their own thoughts about things like spatial planning on a wider context, to lead on things like education development, skills development. They had their own pots of cash that they could spend as long as they spent them sensibly under their own steam, so to speak. And as we changed administrations, a lot of that disappeared. Sarah's kind of touched a bit on some of the other institutions that have come forward over time to try and fill that vacuum. There are things like local enterprise partnerships. There is a Northeast Local Enterprise Partnership. There's one in the Tees Valley. There are approximately 39 across the country. And I think the problem, to an extent, with organisations like that is people often don't know what they do. They're perhaps focused solely on one or two particular agendas, and they've often not necessarily come through a democratic process. Over time, I've been involved in things like city deals, where, for example, there is a Newcastle Gateshead city deal, which is about having a conversation with central government about trying to get more powers and more flexibilities. And they're a bit of a mixed bag and often don't come with funding associated with them. And again, people are not necessarily aware of them. And more recently, we've started to move to a model where government has encouraged the formation of things like combined authorities. So many of you will be aware of the North East Combined Authority, which at the moment is going through a process of, shall we say, re-establishing its footprint and how that works. There is mayoral combined authorities, which tend to have a little bit more power. There is the ability for them to have more say over funding. I suppose, quite a good avenue to have a conversation with central government, and they provide a bit more of a voice, because often you have a spokesperson, like an elected mayor that people have heard of, that can engage with, that they can write to, that's able to put forward principles for a given area about how things should develop over time. And with working in the Tees Valley, obviously there's a mayor there, Ben Houchin. We've touched on some of the other mayors in other areas of the country, and I think probably the key thing there is the profile that they can bring to an area. But in terms of devolution more generally, there hasn't really been anything that necessarily comes across the entire north. I mean, you can debate to an extent what is the north, but more generally, as you get sort of north of London, there hasn't been a body that's able necessarily to talk across a number of agendas to have that conversation with government about what's best for the people in our region and our regions. We have had things like a Northern Powerhouse minister, there's a Northern Powerhouse partnership, but there's semi-ad hoc arrangements. One of the institutions that I was going to talk a little bit about is a body called Transport for the North, and that's an organisation that represents the 9 transport authorities in the northern area, and that's a sub-national transport body. You have this organisation called Transport for the North, and as I'll go into that a bit more, hopefully we can sort of talk a bit about how that might help us to have a voice in areas like transport. But I think something that's been missing from that conversation way back when George Osborne started this conversation in 2014, I personally, as an officer, kind of assumed that there would then be other institutions that would bring forward conversations around skills or education or spatial planning, culture, how do we work together in science and innovation. And to an extent, those things haven't really happened in any sort of formal way that brings together local authorities and elected bodies. And the space is being filled quite admirably by organisations like the Institute for Public Policy Research and other think tanks and bodies that help to drive forward that agenda. But I think in terms of devolution as a whole, that's leaving a gap, or it's not allowing us to cover certain agendas. In terms of Transport for the North, because in our flyer there was a suggestion we talk a little bit about connectivity between regions, and that's kind of hopefully my area of expertise. I wanted to just touch a little bit on Transport for the North, and because that's the first statutory subnational transport body, it is by law able to produce a transport plan for the whole of the north of England. There's a website where you can learn a lot more about that. I'm not here today to sort of bombard you with information about what's exactly in that plan. But that brings together these 19 transport authorities in a formal way that allows partnership with Department for Transport, with Network Rail, with Highways England, with all of those agencies that actually have the money that allows us to invest in infrastructure. And all of this is under an independent chair. Transport for the North's main aim really is about trying to use transport, because transport is a means to an end, not an end in itself, to improve the economy of the north of England, which I think is quite an important component part of what many people try to achieve through devolution and the devolution process. The ambition is to try and improve the economy of the north, to increase, one of the horrible technical phrases, but the gross value added of the area, and to try and add an extra 850,000 jobs to the north of England over the next 20 years or so, using transport as an enabler to bring the city's conurbations together. A lot of this was based around an independent economic review that was carried out about 2.5 years ago by Lord Adonis, some of you may know as a Labour politician, and that focused on what are the key strengths of the North, what are the things that we all are good at that we can work together on to try and bring forward to improve our economy. And that was focused around things like the energy sector, the digital sector, advanced manufacturing, things like that. And just to give you a couple of sort of statistics around some of the things that Transport North is trying to achieve. At the moment, people within a 60-minute train journey of 4 or more major northern cities, in an area that's got a population of around 12 million people, there are 10,000 of them. And so the ambition is to try and increase that footprint so more people can get to these cities more quickly within the 60 minutes, bring that up to the millions by improving train services, et cetera, et cetera. If you were to do the same statistic with businesses within 90 minutes of 4 or more major northern cities, only about 10% of businesses are at the moment, and the ambition is to bring that up to about 40% of businesses. So you can see what Transport of North's trying to achieve. And I just wanted to touch on a few of the things that it's doing, but also I think perhaps then get into some of the problems that make it difficult for TfN to be able to achieve that in the first place. A lot of the project is based around trying to improve rail services, strategic rail services between the major cities, new lines, new upgrades. There's also a project to produce a long-term rail strategy for more regional and local railway lines and how those can be improved. There's some work around defining a major road network for the North and trying to improve how that works in terms of connectivity, etc. Just to give a couple of examples, there is basically, the M62 is the only continuous dual carriageway across the whole of the north of England. How does that enable us to grow if we can't improve some of our other connections? To give a local example, if you were to get the train from, say, Newcastle to Middlesbrough, it would take you 1 hour and 20 minutes, and it's only 40 miles. How is that? And I could give you numerous examples of other parts of the North where that's also a problem. If we can't improve some of this infrastructure and rebalance investment from the south to the north, then how are we going to be able to grow our economy? I think one of the biggest problems around devolution is it's all very well to bring forward plans and strategies, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have influence over funding. I think that's a key point as well, that devolution needs to come with local power and the ability to locally, autonomously decide, based on, of course, evidence and information and local examples, how you can improve not just infrastructure, but culture, innovation, other sort of key component parts of the economy. We've seen more generally in terms of things that have happened in the press lately that we've got some serious issues with things like Northern Rail and Trans-Pennine Express and the rail franchises, and the fact that we've got difficulties even putting on basic rail services to timetable. There have been examples of major government projects being withdrawn, and sometimes the suggestion that there's a bit of a bias in terms of expenditure between the south and the north, and there's quite a lot of statistics produced by organisations like IPPR that have put numbers on how much is being spent per head in areas around central London, for example, compared to the northeast. And there's a huge disparity there, 4 or 5 times the difference, and even disparities within the north about how that works itself. So there's quite a lot of work going on about trying to improve that sort of connectivity between the regions, etc. We also have to say a little bit about skills, and I think that's quite important. I'm a transport planner, but quite often I've been involved in processes where we're thinking about devolution, or we're thinking about plans, or we're thinking about how we can, what do we need to do as areas to improve our lot. And it always comes back to skills and improving them, even from people who aren't skills professionals, and I'm not a skills professional. So I think there's quite a bit of debate there about how we can sort of improve skills more locally. More generally, for some of the infrastructure investment that we'd like to see, if we don't have the skills, who's going to build this infrastructure? Who's going to maintain it? Who's going to allow us to be able to do that with our own resources? More generally as well, we've had a lack of consistency in infrastructure programs. If devolution is about having more local control, one of the issues that we have, certainly in my sort of field of expertise, is a lack of certainty about how much funding is actually available. And even within the devolution process, when we've talked about things like mayoral combined authorities or local enterprise partnerships, etc., a lot of the way to access funding and resources is still competitive and involves putting in bids to central government when there's always more bids than there is money available, which doesn't allow for particularly sort of joined up thinking across many of the policy areas that we have. We've got a bit of a problem with graduate retention in the north. not so much about people who have grown up here and perhaps been to university here, or people who are from the north and have been away to study and then eventually come back. But many of the people who come to the north from other parts of the country, often once they've learned some valuable skills or been through our sort of academic institutions, they leave, they go away again. So we need to understand how we can sort of improve that circumstance as well, really. And I think devolution is also to an extent about us being able to sell the north and sell our areas, and we shouldn't forget that we have a number of unique selling points, and sometimes you don't necessarily want to change things so much that we're almost exactly like London or other areas. I suppose in terms of just trying to wrap up and make a few points about my own views about how the devolution process has worked so far. Some basic conclusions around connectivity. Yes, it is poor, relatively speaking. It suffered from years of underinvestment, and we really need to try and turn the corner, and arguing a lot to have more of that investment, and it should be less of a competitive process between should we do things like our Northern Powerhouse rail project or improve the East Coast Main Line versus should we do HS2 or should we build Crossrail 2 in London. There needs to be much more of a strategic ability to bring forward all of those things. We need more investment in things like our rolling stock and our infrastructure more generally. And that's, we've suffered from a lack of coherent planning over a number of years, and the ability for us to have that conversation across the north, across a number of different areas, not just planning for our transport infrastructure, but planning for how we work collectively to develop things like our energy sector, the advanced manufacturing sector, etc. And that comes back to, having more of these powers available locally. But coming from a bottom-up process where people are involved, rather than, as Sarah mentioned, it being imposed or coming from a top-down way, I think it's fair to say there is a devolution deficit. It's being partially addressed by some of the organisations that we're now able to form, like combined authorities. But that's too piecemeal, and it also still leads to elements of competition within the process. I think there is a real opportunity, though, to demonstrate via organisations like combined authorities that if devolution is given or certain amounts of powers are given, we can build on that, and that we can make a success of being able to allocate funding and develop our own strategies in a way that gives confidence that central government should provide more ability for us to do that as an area. Things like Transport for the North are not a bad building block. It's a very good starting step, but it can't fill the space across all of the policy areas that we have, and so we need to have a think about how we can coherently start to develop that aspect of things as well. Key from my point of view is a very Whitehall-centric approach. There's a real reluctance, and I don't think it's just necessarily from this government, but across many governments, to actually give more power to local areas to be able to develop solutions. The statistics that Sarah quoted about tax-raising powers, how much of that goes centrally, how much is actually available locally, is quite a telling one, particularly as a local authority officer trying to sort of plan how we can actually improve things over time. Also, some views about what about non-metropolitan areas, and how do the processes that have already been put in place allow areas that are not necessarily very densely urban or parts of big cities actually participate in this process and benefit from it. And I thought I'd just wrap up by saying, compounding my final point, that skills retention and development is key. You need skillful people who have a real dedication to help to bring this type of thing forward, to help to contribute to things. So that was perhaps a bit of a trundle across the three sort of bullet points that were beneath the strap line of the talk, but hopefully that just provides us with a little bit of food for thought, and we can hopefully have a bit of debate about the, Northern Powerhouse more generally, where it's going, and where we think it should go from here on in. Thank you.